There's a piece that I was working through that started with Uhura's workbench from Star Trek. But when I first made it, it felt too contrived because it felt like a little piece in a dollhouse. I was trying to talk about this without literally just recreating it, because almost who cares? So I started thinking about fragmentation. What's the most essential part of this object in order to communicate what it is without obfuscating it into abstraction? This fragment of Uhura's bench is in one, I call these things containers. The Uhura workstation fragment is in one section of the container, and then the other is Sun Ra's crown that he wore in Spaces the Place. Formally, there's not a whole lot of association. What I'm interested in is the viewer coming in and like examining and wondering and trying to draw conclusions and figure it out. Maybe trigger associations or contexts that they have in their own frames of reference. I'm not trying to give the viewer an answer, like I want to pose a question.
Heather Hart. Personally, I've been an admirer of yours from afar for a while. I feel really lucky that Tippet Rise has brought us together. Thanks so much for coming. You were trained as a video artist and also as a painter, also as a furniture maker, a sculptor who has a particularly interesting aesthetic. How would you express yourself now as an artist? How do you position yourself now?
I normally call myself interdisciplinary artist or sculptor, and I like sculptor because it's obvious it doesn't really fit exactly, and so you can just kind of let it sit and be awkward and let people think about what sculpture actually means, what that word actually means. When I started as a painter and a video artist and a upholsterer, single forms like that were frustrating because I feel like the audience or the viewer had limited engagement, or they were thinking about it in specific ways that were formalized in institutions away from painting because it was so difficult to find something that engaged folks in the way that I was looking for.
I hope it's okay to say that you're somewhat renowned for this form that you've been working with, a rooftop embedded in the ground or in the site, which of course is also architecture. Can you say a little bit about how this form came to you?
The first rooftop was meant as an exercise in memory. So thinking about growing up with my dad, building an addition to our house and reshingling the roof, and thinking about if I could remember the rules that he gave me to make something structural, and then replaying that, re-performing those rules. Did I remember the 16 inches or 24 inches on center for the beams, the struts, the trusses? Would I be able to make something that was structural? And the form itself came from the rooftops that I grew up under. Because I grew up in Seattle, like there's these A-line roofs that let the snow and rain fall off in, pretty natural way. If you put that rooftop in Brooklyn, it becomes like a little bit foreign. And so this rooftop became more of like a metaphor for me, like as an artist working in the public realm, going into a different space, and either I'm familiar or unfamiliar to different people, either I feel comfortable or uncomfortable in different places. A form, a sculpture, can actually stretch and change depending on the context and the reader, is, I guess, what really excites me.
Is there a context that you've placed it where the form felt like a stranger?
Yeah, there's been many places where it's felt out of place. I mean, the Brooklyn Museum is one of them. Inside anywhere, really. There was a pair that I built in Grand Rapids, and one of the rooftops was in downtown, and at the same time, the exact same roof was in a park in a historically Black neighborhood. And so those both were also programmed at the same time. So you had to make a choice which one you went to, and if those two communicated, and it forced people to kind of imagine or project like what might be happening, like speculative ideas
about what might be happening any other place. And so it estranges something that might have initially felt familiar to them when they make their own choice about where they think they feel comfortable.
Yeah, exactly. When it's outside, people tend to imagine that there's something underground, like the house is actually underground. I really love the ideas that an artwork is different for everybody. I have my own inception of the concepts where it began. That might have begun in my childhood, my great-grandfather. But for somebody else, it could be like Katrina,
Right.
the flood. It could be like possibility and the potential of reaching for the heavens. It could be entirely different. And so I wanted to allow some openness for the visitor to experience and interpret and read in the way that they want, but also always using public programming or collaborations with performers and citizens really to stretch the identity of the sculpture. So it doesn't just exist and stop where I am authoring it. It can carry on and echo into other parts of the world that I would never anticipate. The potential for having it echo and having folks, I guess, take a stake in the read, the legibility of the work, I think is important to me, because a lot of my folks don't feel like a museum or a gallery is for them. I teach kids who don't understand that galleries are free and open for the public. How can we enable people to feel like they can interpret artwork in the same way that anyone else can?
I appreciate that, and appreciate also what I've heard you say from a social practice perspective, that you want to work in the public realm, but you still are very committed to your forms.
Yeah.
One interpretation of community-engaged art that lets the community define the art, which is one way to make work, that you work this dialectic differently. Can you say more about what that means for you?
I consider my practice to be still a studio-based practice in a lot of ways. I want to explore how the forms that I create resonate in different contexts and with different intersections of people. And for me, that feels a little bit like research and a little bit like a get-together, Mm-hmm. But it feels still about me growing and learning in a lot of ways that a painter would in their isolated studio space, When I started moving to 3D, I was really looking for something that would keep people there, and that made me think about somatic resonance. When somebody's physically involved, what kind of memory comes from your body instead of just your brain? Or maybe some parts of your brain you don't access cognitively. And so as much as I can, and entirely, the large sculptures are meant to ask folks to consider physically engaging.
What you've just described seems to me a perfect example of how an artist is trying to create an art project as a kind of event where people make it relevant for themselves. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about our title, Relevance of Place. Both of those are trendy words and now overused words in the art world sometimes. How do you hear those terms?
I want to think first about definitions. I hate the term placemaking.
As if the place isn't there already.
Exactly. So thinking about place versus, let's say, space, I guess I think about place as specific and as having maybe more of a memory. I think about it a lot in terms of social practice, and maybe that's why I have an allergy to it. Space feels like it has the concepts that I'm interested in embedded in it. It's more open. It feels vague and slippery, and it feels infinite and ungraspable. It embodies more of what I'm looking for. I've been doing research around Black space. So, for example, thinking about the Lorraine Motel railing where Martin Luther King was assassinated is one of those spaces. So thinking about how, if that railing was pulled out of context and put into a gallery or another space, if it would hold the same relevance in that other space or in a gallery space. Galleries claim to be so neutral, like that white cube history,
Yeah.
So what happens when you take that railing and put it into a gallery where people can experience it on a one-to-one ratio and trace their hand along the railing? And so there's a certain amount of unknown there that is exciting for me, but also part of research. When I started that project, I realized that the spaces that I was finding in archives and history books were mostly spaces of trauma. and that's not how I knew the Black experience. My family was very joyful. Like, we have a lot of hilarious stories. And so how do I work those into this kind of, for lack of a better word, archive that I'm building? So I started looking at oral histories and looking at fiction, novels, movies, songs, talking to people, and including things that I imagined from those moments, putting them into an object and then thinking about those as 3D printed objects. Then I had like a disjoint about how that fit into my practice. And so I realized that I needed to kind of like not just collect these objects, I wanted to create space. Another piece was the movie Stormy Weather, where the Nicholas brothers danced. There was this like staircase structure that they danced on, and it got like really audacious and bold where they're all over the room. I took that staircase out and remodeled it into a 3D print, and then I also took the Olympic podium from the 1968 Olympics and put it next to the Stormy Weather staircase. And formally, there's actually some interesting similarities.
Yeah.
And conceptually, they're very disjointed, but then you are forced to kind of make a sentence with the two and think about Black power and or audacity or taking up space or like the white gaze, or, you know, there's all sorts of different possibilities. And so that's why I put those two together, I think.
So can we talk more about this site and choosing this site here
Yeah.
at Tippet Rise, which is filled with, you know, all kinds of trees and foliage and all kinds of public art, as well as all kinds of artifacts that recall layers of history.
Yeah.
And you chose this one.
Yeah, so I'm going to get a little raw, a little
Go for it.
vulnerable. So coming here and thinking about what I anticipated the conversation was going to be about, I was only looking at the artworks and thinking about where I wanted to cite myself in this situation. And then driving in, it's so expansive. I had to rethink where I wanted to cite this conversation. What I kept coming back to was how this homesteading house resonated for me. I embody my Black history that I talk a lot about, my father's history. But what I don't talk a lot about, probably to my mother's chagrin, is the Norwegian immigrants of her side of the family. Her grandmother was in utero when that family came from Norway, and they landed in North Dakota. And North Dakota is just butt up against Montana. And there's this picture that my grandmother painted of her mother in front of her homestead house that looked a lot like this. There was that Homestead Act of, I forget, the late 1800s. They granted anyone without a record, quote unquote, which didn't mean anyone, it meant white folks, to come and claim 160 acres if they could, quote unquote, improve it for 5 years. She was a 22-year-old woman and went out and squatted for 5 years by herself. So I think about that being so ballsy and so formative, I think, for the family line in terms of the audacity of women and acceptance of possibility and dreams in that family line. But of course, who owned that property before the government gave it to her? Or who didn't own it? What is ownership? Thinking about the idea of what ownership meant before the colonizers, I felt like there's a lot of exciting possibility in the mission statement at Tippet Rise in a way, thinking about that rewilding and the idea of including Indigenous voices and including histories that might feel a little, friction the reclamation, I guess, is exciting to me. So thinking about this as a site that's complex and fraught, but also beautiful in a lot of ways.
You know, when you think about the mission statement of Tippet Rise and all of the different elements that cohere here or that sometimes cohere in your practice, what comes forward for you?
I was mostly just interested in like that tangle, like you said, like all of these different mediums coming together. And I think one of the things that excited me was the idea of like really an inception of a multidisciplinary approach to something. So like, is there a musician that works with the sculptor that works with the land that ends up in a poem, you know? So
Right.
It's this like chain letter of medium that you can imagine.
I have to say, a lot of the layers of your practice that you've described are examples of that, examples of what the mission statement calls the algorithm. Thank you for going so deeply and expansively in helping us think about this place, this space, and how it's relevant and how it might be more relevant, and for sharing your practice.
My pleasure.